Oh, there we go. We're recording. I'm going to go ahead. I'm very, very sorry. I had made some plans for this evening. I thought we were going to finish early today, and that's not going to happen. So I switched to Deer, and I'm just going to get started here. And this is going to be a serious fire hose, so pay attention. All right. So I'm going to talk about Transaction Box. This is something I've been working on, golly, for really quite a long time, probably about 9 months or so. It's really been taking pretty much all of my time. Welcome to my talk. Charlotte says hi. I've been doing a lot of other stuff related to this, so it's all kind of worked into this. This in replay, I've really been what I've done this year. Let's see. So what this is supposed to do is the plugin. It's Transaction Box like a toolbox. It's a toolbox for transactions. So the whole point of this is to do transaction manipulation in a plugin. You say, oh gosh, we've already got that. This is way cooler. All right, so I did, the people at the Beijing Summit, I did an attempt to redo remap config in YAML, and you guys all laughed at it. I'm still, hurt deep inside about that. And then what I did was I made a second mistake. I talked to Miles about what I should do instead, and Miles says, hey, Alan, that's a great idea. Thanks, Miles. See, he's not denying it. Anyway, so what are y'all doing? So what was I actually trying to do here? So there's a whole bunch of things because I can never do a simple project. It's just not how I roll. We want to do YAML configuration. This is the first thing. I wanted a rich set of proxy data access mechanisms so you can reach into the proxy and get all sorts of interesting data out of it. Data about the transaction, about the session, about the proxy, about all sorts of other things. I wanted to be able to have a large set of things to manipulate the transaction. It's a transaction toolbox, so you need to have lots of things you can do, tools you can use. I also need more specialized decision and comparison operators rather than just string matching and regex matching. Also, this was a really big one for me. So a lot of these plugins, you can get data and you can use data, and these things are frequently completely disconnected. One of the fundamental design goals here is to say if you can get data, you can use it in any context. If you can use it to set a header, you can use it to make decisions, you can use it to do messages. If you can get the data, you can use it. So that was a big goal for me. And I also wanted it to be easily extendable, right? One of the reasons we do have this massive collection of transaction manipulation plugins that all do a little tiny thing was that it was easier to write a new plugin than to extend the existing ones. Okay, and that's a problem. So one of the things I wanted to solve here is to say, no, I want it to be easier to extend Transaction Box to do what you want than it would be to write a new plugin. All right. So originally I thought about doing this in the core. I switched to a plugin because it gives me lots of advantages. I can iterate a lot faster. As you know, I've done hundreds of commits on this already since I started it, which is one of the reasons there's not quite so many commits in Traffic Server because I've been committing here. You can fork it, you can experiment with it. If people want to test it, they can toss it into their tests or their prod things and then pull it out if it doesn't quite work without having to revert Traffic Server versions. So that's why it's a plugin. So also, this is still pretty early. It's really just barely alpha quality right now, but I didn't want to get everything set in stone, just like our previous speaker said, and then find out that no one liked it, right? So this is still very early. I'm going to say a lot of things, but almost all of this is mutable at this point. There's a few fundamental things that you can't be changed, but a lot of the style of it could easily be changed. So like we can't change that it's YAML, but we can change how the YAML is structured, right? So it's out in a repo. Thanks to Rosalie here, it's open sourced officially. Here's some documentation. This is really out of date, but it should give you a little bit of flavor. If you want this slide deck, there it is. And I have a Slack channel that I talk about this to myself on. Alrighty, Bob. Okay, why did we do this? So Mark told me I had to do this part of the slide deck. Thanks, Mark. So why are we doing this? So actually, I'm going to skip through this very quickly because a lot of people have already discussed a lot of these issues. So, okay, we know how Traffic Server does these things. I want to try to unify this so that you can control all three of these, the proxying, the caching, the routing, from a single plugin. This is part of my whole effort that I've been pushing for the last couple of years about request routing, to say I don't want to route based on a URL, I want to route based on a request. The client sent me a request, and I want to use that to decide where my upstream is. This ties in very tightly with the Layer 7 routing project of John and Aaron and VJ. We're going to interact with that. Okay. Request routing, URL information. This is something we get. So one of the things is that you can't move stuff in current remap between like the host and the URL. Trivial inside transaction box, because you can access these pieces and then you can use them. Regular expression matching. So this will let you apply regular expression matching to pretty much any part of the request. So you can regex express match on a header, for instance, if it happens to turn your crank. Okay. Actually, you could actually match on the query parameters based on the design. So you could actually match on HLS, are there HLS prefixed query parameters in this request, if you want an actual example that might come up. This is actually I-1971. Miles remembers this one too. Miles, you've just been such a great partner in this whole effort. Is that we didn't have the current ACL stuff, and the remap is if you have a single ACL, then it works. But if you put more than one in, it either doesn't work or doesn't do what you expect. It simply is, in my opinion, flat out broken. It's one of the reasons I did the work that came up in Beijing, because that would have fixed that. So you can't fail over. So if the access doesn't work, you've already committed to that rule, and there's some issues there. So I think I can do a lot better than that. Well, remap config syntax. Well, enough said. This is one that Leif bugs me, so it's not entirely Miles's fault. Is that we go through and we do these checks on URLs and various pieces of the request over and over and over. So every time we have another plugin, we're doing another check on whether it matches certain patterns. So it would be great in terms of utility and performance if we could just do those kind of checks once and then do a bunch of things based on that check. And of course, with performance, one of the things that came up when I started working on this was that with YAML, you have a lot more information about the structure of things. You can do all sorts of interesting optimizations to increase performance without making the ops guys do weird things. Now, not that they don't like to do weird things, but they don't like it when you make them. Sometimes I hear back. Also, I want to do, one of the things I looked at, we know that regular expressions are a performance hit, but I look at Evil Dave's actual rules in the remap, like at least half of them, if not more, are only prefix and suffix checking. That's all the regex is doing. So this is what I meant by a wider variety of comparisons. If you can just have a prefix and suffix, I guarantee that will be way faster than a regex match. Okay, and it, whoops. Oh. Great. Roger's infected me. Okay, now go to the top. Where are we? All right, forget that. That's broken. Stop. Golly. Okay. All right. Too many toys. All right. So, how did I design this? I like to start with basics and have the smaller number of powerful mechanisms that you can reuse to get the result you want. So this here is the heart of Transaction Box. This is actually what it does, and everything else is kind of secondary to this, and I call it feature extraction. Thanks, Ed. This is also modeled on packet cracking. If you've read network things, there's ASICs that do feature extraction from network packets, and this is the same concept here. What we do is we have a request, and we're not going to ever look at the entire request. Nobody does that. They're going to pick pieces out of it and look at those pieces. Okay, so we call this kind of mask. You're going to take the request, you're going to put this cutout mask on it and see what shines through. And I call that a feature. And the act of getting that data out of the request is extraction. So Transaction Box is all about this feature extraction. And that's where a lot of the power comes from, because you just have a feature and there's a general mechanism for reaching in and grabbing various different pieces of the transaction. But once you have the feature, it doesn't matter where it came from. There's no special rules about different parts of the request or different things. You just have an extractor for it. It gets the feature out. You look at it. And so with these features, you can use them for selection, you can use them for messages, you can use them for values. It's all the same. So for notation, in terms of using this, I picked Python-styled format strings. So the feature extraction is basically a format string that says, here's the features I want to pull out. You can put literal text in there, you can put multiple extractors, and off you go. So like Python, you can have a name to start with here, and then you have some formatting options. These format options, just like Python's, you can make it a fixed width, you can shrink it, you can put it in uppercase. The capital S here means put it in uppercase, which actually for addresses can matter if it's V6. And another extension, which isn't Python, where you can pass a little bit of extra information to the extractor. Now in practice, when you use this, it's pretty unusual. Actually, that's the next slide. It's actually pretty unusual to use those extra formatting features. They're there for some unusual cases. But in general, what you're going to do is 90% of the time, you're going to extract a single feature with no formatting. Right? So this one says, I just want the remote address for the client session, which is an IP address. So the rule I adopted was if there's no quotes on it, then it's an extractor. It needs to be just a single extractor getting some data. If you want a string, put quotes around it. And I added this literal here, so you can just say, no, I don't want to do a bunch of escapes and stuff. If you say, that's literal, well, it's a literal. It's just this string here. All right, now, all extractors can produce strings. So any extractor that you can use can be used as a string. But some of them can produce other types, like the one we just saw, the IP address. So the currently supported types you can get out are string, integer, Boolean, IP address, a cons, and a tuple. Who here actually knows what a cons or a cons cell is? All right, we got one. All right, well, then don't worry about that. It turns out to be useful in some more advanced stuff that I'm not sure I'm going to get into today. Now, this is a cute idea that actually ended up being much more powerful than it was when I originally thought of it. So what we can do is once we extract a feature, we can put modifiers on it. We can say, I want to change that feature. I'm going to do some post-processing on it. In this case, what we're doing is we're doing a hash on it. So I say, I want to take that string, I want to hash it, and I want to put it into 4,096 buckets, right? So I get a hash value from 0 to 4,095, or maybe from 1 to 4,096. I haven't decided yet. You want to give me some feedback on that. So I'll show you later where this comes in handy, but some of the modifiers I'm going to do, want to be able to hashing, want to do string manipulation, so you can do substrings, uppercase, lowercase, all sorts of modifiers like that. You know, you could do allow URI or encoding or decoding. So you can, I want to pull that thing out, and then I want to URI decode it. Does that sound familiar, Dave? IP address processing and some list processing. All right, so let's get into some actual mechanics here. So the primary mechanic inside transaction box is selection. What this means, so we want to define some terms here. So directive is what I call something that it's going to do, an actual manipulation of the transaction or something else. A comparison is pretty much what you think. It has some fixed value, and it's going to compare it to a feature, right? And it's going to match or it's going to not match. So prefix is a comparison. It has some string that's the prefix, and either the feature has that prefix or it doesn't. So selection is where we take it, we extract a feature, we run some comparisons against it, and then based on the comparison, we execute some directives, right? So it's basically a switch statement, a case statement, like that. And it's modeled on remap config, where conceptually, you can think of remap config as doing a URL host extraction and then doing a big select on that. What we do with transaction box is say we want to completely generalize that, so you can extract any feature you want and then have a list of any type of comparisons you want on it. And you can nest them. Okay, so I can have a select that does some directives, and those directives can themselves be selects, when those in turn can be more selects. So you can slice up your decision space on whatever parameters you like, right? If you want to slice on URL first, that's great. Or if you want to slice on host first, you could do that. This is something that came up inspired by Ed Hall back there. But I think it works well. We don't allow, once you've gone through a selection and gone down a branch, you can't come back. The rest of the configuration is irrelevant at that point. You're locked in there. This has various properties. I like the lack of ambiguity so that if you get to a place in the config, you know exactly how you got there. There's only one path. You didn't go down somewhere and come back and then get to there. Does that make any sense? So you know what happened when it gets there. This can also, I realized today on one of the previous talks with self-service multi-property, multi-tenant issues, because you can wrap the tenant stuff inside your selection. Then you know that once you go past there, that tenant can't make anything come back up and gets into somebody else's stuff. But this is a big issue. Now I might put an escape in for this. I've been considering that, but we'll not talk about that today yet. Comparisons. So for each comparison, you can have a do, and the do is a list of directives, and if the comparison matches, you do those. Various comparisons, all the standard ones you'd expect, numeric comparisons, logic ones. So if you want to nest, if you want to do a bunch of checks at the same time, you can AND them. Any of is or, all of is an and none of is a not. So you can not things. So this is one of the ways we address the negative regexes. So if you wanted a negative regex, you'd make a positive regex, and then you'd say none of. IP address comparisons and some list comparisons. So if you have a list of things, you can say, I want to match for all of them, for any of them, or for none of them. Actually, and there's tuple comparisons too, but, well, we'll skip that. Okay, let us look at some actual example of what a config would look like. Here's an example. This is a selection example. So here we have the with, and it says, okay, with, and this is the feature going to extract the host out of the client request, then select. Now, yeah, some of this syntax is driven because it's YAML. So I tried as much as possible not to do things outside of the YAML syntax to make it maximally parsable and configurable and generatable, right? So you didn't have to have special rules. So we have to have the select basic so we can have a list here. So select is a list of comparisons. The first comparison is match, which is the string literal match. And so it says, well, if the host is exactly this, then I'm going to set the white target field in the proxy request to special. If it's any other yahoo.com, then I'm going to set white target to standard. And if it's an AOL.com, then I'm going to set the white target to other and the v target to AOL. So this is pretty much what it looks like. Let's see, this is kind of a place I remember a place. So for regular expressions, when you apply regular expressions, the transaction box notices that, and it makes a record of the match groups that are in the expression, and then you can use them later in the extractor in the standard way. So brace 0 is the whole match, brace 1 is the first group, brace 2 is the second group, blah, blah, blah. This is how we get the move stuff around thing. So if you match against the whole URL, and even moderately sophisticated regular expression, you can pick the pieces out you want, and then you can just stick them into this. Now notice that you can not only use this for setting values, but you could select on that, right? So you could rearrange the URL and then select on it. And what we're going to use suffixes on match, RX and NC to convert between regular expression matching and literal matching, and then NC is case sensitive or not case sensitive. I have gone back and forth. This is the 4th different mechanism I've used for this. It's really a hard problem to do something clean in YAML to indicate these differences, but I've settled on this as the best option currently. Okay, here's my big slide. Any feature usable for selection can also use a value, and it's exactly the same syntax, right? There is only one feature string syntax. It works everywhere. All right. Now hooks. Now obviously we don't want to just have these directives going off at random places during the transaction. Well, Evan might, but he's a little strange. So we need to attach them to hooks. So what I ended up doing is creating a when directive. And so the when directive takes a value, it specifies a hook. Now if you're globally configuring transaction box, all the top level directives have to be when. And what that means is that every directive is then explicitly attached to a particular hook. Does that make any sense? All right. For remap, if you're configuring as a remap, you don't have to do that. There's an implicit when remap wrapped around the config. So because it's a remap if you're calling it a remap, it's during remap. You know what hook it's on. Now, there's a fun little bit here is that when is a directive, which means it can be used any place a directive can be used, which means anytime you do a match on one hook, you can say, oh, on this later hook, I want you to do these other things. So it's another form of consolidation where if you're doing matching on the client request and you want to do some additional processing on the response, you just put a when in there. And it only get attached if that initial selection matches. The when directive, when it executes, doesn't do anything directly. It, in effect, schedules its contained directives for that other hook. So I think that's going to be really handy in remap. So if you do the remap thing, then you can put a when in there to do something later. IP addresses. What we're going to do for this, I'm going to create a thing called an IP space. Has anyone here besides me used the IP map class in Traffic Server? Okay. Right, so an IP space is basically a coloring of the IP address space. And the color is basically a set of properties, and each property has a value. So you can attach these properties and values. For anyone who's used YNetDB, which is a Yahoo thing, which classifies networks into production networks and external networks and host networks. So the property would be network type, and the values would be production, host, internal. And this lets you map from the IP address to that property value. All right. So here's an example. I was studying for Josh, that data scientist that Jim talked about a lot but refused to name in public. So here we have an example of the file that you would load to create the space. We say, well, here's a range, and property 1 is alpha, property 2 is beta. Here's another range, and property 1 in this range is gamma, and the property 3 is delta. So inside transaction box, you say, okay, I'm going to define the IP space. Here's the name of the space. Here's where you get the data. And then I can say, okay, well, I'm going to start with the client session remote address, and I'm going to transform it with the IP space into the property value. Because as property 1, it's going to be alpha or gamma or the empty string. So you can consolidate these things and then do this very fast mapping from the IP address to a particular property. It's a PRIX property 1 because when we did the modification, I said that I wanted the prop 1 value. So I've tested, I have code that does this from a very old project, actually even before Traffic Server, and I tested it with 540,000 networks, and it was fast. In the sub-microsecond lookup range. So entirely fast enough for real time. It's not going to be that fast because I'm going to have to add some additional features, but I'm still hoping to get lookups in under 10 microseconds. So anyway, so let's look at some examples. Let me just do a couple of these. This is one that actually came up as all of these all these examples, if you want to look at the slides, are from actual bugs filed against me inside legacy Yahoo. So every single one of these is an actual bug I'm expected to solve, and I want to solve them with transaction box. So this one, this was one of the original that brought up 1971 about access controls. What they wanted is they want to say, I want to allow people in, but if they're not allowed in, I want it to look like the thing isn't even there. So this turns out not to be too hard. We say when we get a client request in, we look at the path. If the path is the thing that we care about, then we look at the remote address. If it's in this network or that network, then great, we write it to the HTTP status and we get the internal status. Otherwise, we do nothing. There's no remap. It's a 404. It's as if it's not there. Right, because you couldn't do that. If you did this with a remap, you'd have to have a remap rule for this. And once you've picked it, you're not going to get the 404. Right.
What's that double brace notation? Double brace HTTP status?
Because I base this on Python, in Python, if you double brace, it's an escape for the brace.
So you actually do want to brace around the status.
Yes.
But it will evaluate the status as the status.
No.
It's going to be...
So this will be the literal string, brace, HTTP-status brace.
Oh, okay.
So it's not a feature.
It's not a feature extractor because there's no real brace there.
Okay.
Right, it's like an escaped quote. It doesn't create a new string. It's just... Oh,
you're changing the URL itself. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. that's how Python does it, and I want it to be as compatible as possible. Well, let's get, this one was a little fun. This says, oh, if I get a 403 for particular paths, I want to convert it to a 204 instead. This is some sort of AWS thing. I don't know. They don't explain why I need to do these things. So they say, okay, when we get the upstream response, we look at the status of 403. We're going to look at the host, and if it matches with case-insensitive local host, then we're going to look at the path at that point. If it's a config slash, well, that's the thing we want to do. We're going to set the status, we're going to set the reason, and when we actually send the response, so this is the upstream response, so we've just gotten the response from the upstream. When we actually send it, you have to end up removing these fields because of the 204 or things break. But this is mainly an example of how when can be used to do future processing after you've already figured out this is the thing you want to do. Okay, default accept encoding to identity. There you go, boom. So this says if a thing comes in and doesn't have an accept encoding, I make the accept encoding identity. There you go, just like that. All right, we're going to skip that. This is some fancy, that was some fancy YAML stuff we don't need to need. All right, so this is what you didn't get at ApacheCon. I'm going to talk about some of the internal implementation of how all this stuff works. So transaction box depends on two external libraries, YAML CPP, same one as used in the ATS core. It also depends on this super magic library, solid wall of C++ library. Is there anyone here who can guess who the primary author of that is? No, okay. So this library is actually a bunch of utility classes that are on the ATS core, but I've pulled them out so that I can do a lot of work on them in a very rapid pace. So these are not, they're really quite a bit different than what's still on the traffic server core. Really quite a bit different. There's a couple of other classes I've added. Yeah. But that's done as a separate library because this is actually used in the replay tool as well. And I'm going to use it in my canned YAML project whenever I get back to that. Okay, feature types. The actual feature types, we have an int_max_t, bool, text view, IP adder, cons, and memview. Most of these are going to be unfamiliar to you. Memview, I think that's actually in traffic server. I think that's in the core. It's like a string view except it's writable. It's basically an array wrapper. Lets you do dynamic arrays, halfway between vector and standard array. So the features, feature is really a standard variant of all of these. That's what you actually get. So configuration loading, we use Memorina class to do memory management. It's Memorina is an arena class. It lets me allocate stuff. It doesn't deallocate, but then when you get rid of the arena, it cleans up all the memory. Amortizes lots of little allocations, which is perfect for what we're doing here. When we load up or create a configuration class, we load all the relevant configuration data into it, then we throw away the YAML data. So we don't carry around all the YAML parse data forever. So also the configuration tends to be much more expensive and complex than it might otherwise be because it's designed to optimize runtime. So if I had a choice between making the config loading complex or making the runtime slower, I made the config more complex to gain time and performance in the runtime. So it does a lot of computations during the config loading, like checking if you use a regular expression and it needs to decide if it wants to save the capture groups, it can look ahead and say, wow, does he ever actually use those again? No, he doesn't. Well, then I won't bother saving them. There's also, of course, a runtime contacts. This is created for each transaction. So when the transaction fires up and you need to use transaction box, it creates an instance of this class. It has its own Memorina for storing transaction local data. We get a lot of transient strings, so those are put inside the Memorina. I stole an idea from one of the other traffic server classes. So Memorina maintains, there's always free space in a Memorina. You're doing block allocation and there's some free space at the end of the block. That's available for use. You can put things in there very temporarily. If you don't use them again, you don't have the overhead of allocating for them all the time. All the directives, comparisons, and extractors get access to this, and this is where they can get to the transaction, the session, all the strings, and all sorts of other various data. So feature strings, there's a parser in there that parses the feature strings. If you are writing a directive and you say, I want my thing to be a feature, There's just one call you make to say, hey, take this value and parse it up for me. It handles the feature extraction, it handles looking up the extractors, it handles the modifiers and all of that good stuff. And then when you actually at runtime, there's a call to the context to say, hey, I've got this parsed feature string, why don't you get the data for me? And it hands you back a feature. So this is much evolved from the original one. There's a lot more work in the original directives, and I spent a lot of time over the last 2 or 3 months cleaning this up to really reduce the amount of boilerplate code you have to put into the comparison and directive and extractor logic. All right. So I wanted to make this extensive. I wanted to be able people to say, oh, wow, I don't want to write another plugin. I just want to write a new extractor or a new directive for transaction box. So I'd eat my own dog food because it's the best way to improve things. So if you look at the code, which is out there, the comparison and extractions directives that are actually implemented use exactly the same API that any extension would use. I give them no special privileges. Anything they can do is also available to anyone who wants to extend it. Because though it works, you can actually put them in separate files. So you could make a fork, put your special directives in a different file, and be able to maintain that fork fairly easily because it's a separate file. So we have extractors. So the extractors, you can write your own extractors. They have to return a feature. Generally, they'll specify what type of feature they want to return. You always have to be able to do it as a string, though. That's an absolute requirement that any extractor has to be able to render it as a string. It's actually not very burdensome because you have the internal formatting logic, so you can just tell it, format this thing, put it out as a string. So I'm not going to talk about this very much. So this is the IP space. This lets us do very fast IP lookups for properties. I think this is going to be really cool. So I talked about this in the tech corner. I've been doing a different C++ API for traffic server in here, much more of a bottom-up one, where rather than being a framework that you fit into, it simply wraps a lot of the traffic server C API objects to do, automatic cleanup and allocation. And so if I have a request and I want a mine field, I just say find. I don't have to do all the other stuff to index through it and do all of that stuff. I just say find this field, give it to me, and off it goes. Oh yeah, can I hear pull request? No. Okay. So these are some open issues that I'm still looking at. Wow, I'm actually blowing through this quick. You guys will never remember any of this. So maybe we should stop for questions. Does anyone have any questions on this at all? This is also incredibly obvious that you're going to write transaction box configs tomorrow. It looks like a big yes to me. You can run a global or remap. Well, okay, so in both cases, an excellent question. So in both cases, what you do is you have to give it a configuration file. You have to say, here's the file with the configuration in it. Now, I tweaked it so that you can also give it a second parameter that says, here's the key in the file where my configuration is. So you can actually have a bunch of different configurations in the same file and then pick them out with a secondary. If you don't do that, then it defaults for global, defaults to TXN box as the top level key, just like we've agreed for all the YAML things. And for remap, it assumes the whole file is the configuration because it's remap. So in the global one, you have to put a when. If you have a directive that's a top level that's not a when, it will complain and say, no, you lose, you can't do that. So because it has to know what hook to put the directives on. For remap, it conceptually puts a when remap around it because it's a remap. It's going to get called during remap, so it just does that for you. Other than that, there's not a lot of difference between them. Variables are going to be a lot of fun. I've been working very hard to get so that if you set variables in a global hook from the global side, they're visible in the remap. And if you muck with them in the remap, they're visible in later hooks, even if it's from a global declaration. I want that to be, transition be absolutely smooth, right? So if you call it from remap or you call it from the global, it doesn't matter. They're in the same space. Yeah, so I've been looking at, so I'm using dot right now to separate the directive from this arg here that says what to do. I'm thinking about changing that to an at. I don't know. Maybe I'm worrying about this too much. Well, then the second out would be part of the at header. Well, I already have this problem with dot because a lot of these things have, well, actually not for headers, but when there's a txn conf directive, which takes a config variable name, and it has that problem. So you just say whatever the first dot is, that's the end, and everything past that is the name. And this would work the same way. I'm hoping to get rid of the at headers, because by putting in variables in here. So you can set a variable which lives in the transaction box space, not in the actual header. And then be able to look at that. Really? Most of the uses I've seen they've used for communication between hooks.
Remove the at headers, or if you're thinking of removing the at headers, I'm wondering if it'll miss some cases, like depending on when this plugin will run, depending on the order of the plugin, if you need to set something before this plugin is run.
But don't you have the same problem with the ad headers now? I mean, I'm not saying I'm going to actually go in and remove the ad headers. I want to make them so that people say we don't care if you remove them.
Right.
So we'll see how successful that is. Right. But I mean, you have the ordering problem in any case. Plugin coordination. Any volunteers to help with that? No. All right. Let's see. So this one came up earlier during John's talk. Dealing with multiple configuration files. Evil Dave got on my case about this. He said you have to be able to split these things into multiple files. I am strongly leaning toward the directory-based loading, where you say, if you give me a directory, if you give me a configuration file and it turns out to be a directory, I'll go in there and I'll find every YAML file and I'll load them. And I'll load them in the ls directory order, because that's pretty standard for a lot of Unix stuff, is you just go in and say, well, if you put 10 and 11 and 12 in front of them to get stuff, it's ugly, but it's a well-known standard kind of technique. So, you know, that's likely where I'm going. Actually, I thought about this, John, later. If you did a colon include, if you did an include colon name, then it would be valid YAML and be less how can I express this? You could put it into things that recognize YAML and not have it barf because it's a pound. But I guess it's because it's a comment too. Include. So let's see. I also have to work on duration. I don't really deal with this well right now. You'd like to be able to talk about time. So for instance, you'd like to be able to say, I want to set the cache TTL to 3 days for this guy. And the question is, how exactly do you express 3 days? You know, we could do it with the Extractor type extension. So you say, okay, well, I'm going to put the extended data of MS, which means milliseconds. You could do YAML type tags in front to say bang MS to say this is 100. This is what I'm currently looking at doing here. So these two would be equivalent here. Anyone has any suggestions how we deal with this? I need a name for always match. So anytime you have select, you want something that says, hey, match. Whatever it is, I match, right? This is my favorite here, but we might want to do something else. Otherwise, it's probably my second favorite. So we need to look at that. All right, let's talk a little about the future. This is my Void Hawk. It's a PML 3-inch kit with a Giant Leap boat tail motor retainer here. This is flying on an H-123. It was a mostly good flight. We had a little deployment failure, but the rocket survived. Okay, yes, I am working on documentation. You can see there is some documentation now. I need to update that. Let's see. I need to put a whole bunch more extractors in. I've been kind of waiting until I settle down on how the extractors are going to work, but I want to be able to get into session data. I actually did that. I had, there is one in there that lets you pull out the client session SNI name. So there's an extractor for that. I want to get the TLS data out. I want to put it a random number generator. Any guesses what that would be used for? Yes, exactly. So this is the plan for one of the 2 ways I have for doing ramping. So you can put a random number generator in there and say, I want to generate a number from 1 to 100, and then you do an equal 1 after it in with rand select equal 1, right? And do different things. I want to be able to reach into the cookies. I want to be able to reach in the stat counters. I'm not sure about the transaction and session arguments because who knows what they are. I mean, I can get the void stars out. It's unclear how useful you can actually look at those. Let's see. Oh, this is old. I already figured that out. So, and then, yeah, and the hash is the other way you can do ramping. So, because you want it more deterministic, you say, well, I'm going to hash into 4,096 buckets, and I'm going to use 1 or 2 of those buckets are going to go there. Otherwise, it's going to go to the normal place, right? And both of those cases are useful depending exactly how you want to do things or what you're doing with your A/B testing. Variables. This is a big thing I want to get done, where you can set variables and get the values back later, particularly between hooks. I guess from my point of view, when I see the headers, they use them for this kind of communication. And so if it's logging, I guess that's a little different. Let's see. Not currently. I'm not sure what to do about that. There's nothing that stops you from, although is there any C API to let you write a log entry? I don't think there is. There is, I will tell you this, I wasn't going to mention it. Yes, now, one of the things I did put in here for my own stuff, but I'll let you share because I'm a nice guy, is there's a message directive. And what it does is it takes 1 or 2 values, either a value or a list of a value, and it does a TS debug. And so if you just put in a single string, it'll TS debug transaction box that string, or you can put in the debug tag you'd like to use and have it do that, and it'll call TS debug for you. So it's really, really cute when you're doing bugs, especially since the message can be in a feature string. So you say, well, I'm selecting on this URL. You can put that into the feature string with some other decoration and just log it out. So that ended up being really kind of cool. Let's see, what else you got? Session support, we have to do, Sudir's brought this up, other people brought this up, we need to get more into sessions, so I want to make sure that session box, first I want to be able to get session data, and then I want to look at being able to get on session hooks. Yeah, it looks like it's going to be quite a bit of work, but it's going to be just work. I don't see any deep technological issues with creating that. There's A/B testing, so we talked about this. I hash the thing, and then I say, well, if it's exactly 0, then I do this. Otherwise, on you go, right? All right, now we're going to get some really funky stuff. I don't know. Looks like most people spaced already. Anyway, but I put in tuple and console, so these let me do list representations. This actually came up from a request about query strings, because people wanted to manipulate query strings. So if you say, I want the query, what do you actually get back? So I ended up doing a list support, so you can get back a list of items, right? And that's all the query values. You can say, like, okay, if you have a key in the query string, you're allowed to repeat it. Did you guys know that? You can have, Randall equals this, semicolon, Randall equals that, semicolon on. So when you ask for the Randall value, the value of Randall in the query, it's not a string, it's a list of strings, and it's important that they're in different places. So this is really a derivative of wanting to do that. It also comes with cookies. So I think when we go to cookies and look at cookies, we're going to use the same sort of thing. You don't really have to worry about this too much from an administrative point of view. These are different inside the implementation, but they really basically do the same thing, support lists. So then that's where the for all and for none. So you can say, I'm going to say, for the query value Randall, for any of them match this value, I'm going to do something. And that lets you search the list of all the Randall query values in the query string and see if any of them match your magic thing, then I'm going to do something different. Right? Which is simpler than trying to do a regex on that. Right? This gives the transaction box can pick it apart for you and not trying to do that in a regex gets fun. Anyway, so that's kind of list stuff. So for the list manipulation, I'll put in some basic stuff. This is all really easy to implement. Prepend, append, prefix, suffix, where you clip the backer off. Do a replace. You can do regex matching or substitution on the values in the list. drop elements, split and join, the standard Python, Perl, split join stuff. You guys have all done that. So Aaron and I are also working on getting this to interact with layer 7 routing projects. You can do things like say, okay, the directive of set the strategy, set some other marks so that the strategizer gets more information. Say, I want to use this parent list, I want to use that parent list, right? It's not going to do the parent selection. Like the normal stuff with traffic server is it assumes that there's an engine and traffic server doing the work, and all what I need to do is I need to set certain values and keys for that so it does the work I want it to do, right? That's the traffic server way of doing things. So I'm going to be very clear, we're not going to put, this isn't going to do the routing, this is going to set parameters so that the parent stuff does the routing I want in this particular case. So this is fun. I want to be able to call other plugins. This relates to what we talked about at lunch about calling Rust. So in this case, when I've looked at this and thought about this quite a bit, I don't want to have a fixed point. So inside, because it's YAML, I can say, here is the actual name of the function I want you to call. So it's not a fixed function. So you can put in other .sos as plugins which serve as computation engines, same way you were doing the Rust stuff, right? I have something, it's too much pain to put into a directive or it's too specialized or whatever, so I'll create another .sso with a function that just does this computation, and then I'll call it from transaction box, right? And then that other thing doesn't have to do any of the plugin initialization, it just has to perform its one specific computation, right? As you said, that's a way to put libraries in, so you can call these library things. You'd probably need some glue. I'm still looking at what the argument list would look like. You either pass a list. You know, you can use the Perl style where you say, well, I always pass you a list. And if it's only one long, well, then it's only one long, right? But it's always a list of features, right? Does this make any sense? I mean, that's how the Perl syntax works. So I'm thinking about doing the same thing. It's a little ugly, but not too bad. And it just simplifies the whole interface logic. All right, now we're getting really obscure. I want to do some, move on. Don't care about that step. So what am I actually working on here? So the current state of things is that we have, in fact, done production testing with this, and it actually went very well. I have all my limbs after meeting Dave, so that's a good sign. What we did was we took a remap rule that had 4 or 5 plugins attached to it that did different things, conf remap and regex remap, and I don't even remember what else, and replaced them all with a single call to transaction box. So, and that went fine. So that was very encouraging. It really gave me hope that this thing will actually work. So the next step I need to do, or these are the things I'm working on now. I'm hoping to get done in Q4. I want to get the IP space stuff in, because I want to replace a particular plugin in the stack that we use that everybody hates. And I also promised Josh that I'd make this available to him because he wants to use it from some of his other things, the ability to do this processing of large IP spaces. Because that 540,000 network file is actually a file that he had been working with. So we want to be able to do that. I really want to do variables. I think those are going to be very powerful. Maybe, you know, I just need to be able to set those and get them back later will be great. And this is for Valerie. So one of the things I really want to do here is to be able to optimize the execution of the configuration in an automatic way without having to make the operators do crazy things. I already mentioned that. So this is your super long redirect list. That's what this is about, right? So be able to say, okay, wow, I've got this list of what? What was it, 30,000? Something like that. 30,000 literal strings I want to match. Well, a linear search is going to really not perform particularly well, right? So I want to rig it so that I can, so the transaction box says, gosh, I've got this huge list of literal strings. I'll make a tree or an unordered map or some other clever data structure and do a fast search on it. So that's an important thing for actually getting this out in the field. And that's it. Wow. I've got a bunch of, well, another picture of Charlotte. And some other, yeah, we probably don't want to go through that. Let's just do questions. Any questions?
What are all the plugins that this will subsume or replace?
You want an honest answer?
Yeah.
All of them.
Okay. That'll be amazing, yeah, if you get this.
It's certainly partial is to be. It's going to kill header rewrite, right? That's just gone. Conf remap is gone. Regex remap is gone. I want to replace client whitelist. I want to replace Yahoo connection. Gosh, what are some of the other ones that I've seen?
Cache key related plugins? I don't know.
The which one?
There's some cache plugins, cache key related stuff.
Oh yeah, cache key is gone. Sorry, Goncho. Because I mean, in this place, the cache key plugin is replaced by cache key : feature string.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm sorry, but that's just it. It just falls out. So cache key's another one.
Escalate.
Well, escalate maybe not, but possibly. What? What is that? That to redirects?
It's a failover.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I can probably do that. I mean, I've been playing with the redirect stuff, so I've got redirect support in transaction box to say, well, redirect here with this reason, with the body and stuff. Where did that? That's actually one of the examples we skipped. So yeah, this is the Valerie thing where we say, okay, well, if it's one of these, so in her case, there'd be this list would be 30,000 long, right? And we say, okay, well, if the host is this particular thing, then do a redirect here. And you can see how we're doing some substitution here. So this is a feature string here. So it's extract a feature. Well, here's a bunch of literal text. And we're going to put the client request URL in here, and we're going to put the location field. So this here means that. And so that lets you do some really cute things. For the YAML heads out there, you all got strong stomachs, right? Okay, here's some YAML fun. So we go up in the top of the file, we define a YAML anchor here, redirect body that says status 01 reason, blah, and then we have that same thing here. Then when we use it here, this location refers to that. So then we can just sub in much more efficiently down here. Yeah. I don't see how that would be relevant here. I mean, this is all in the same header file. All right. Well, I mean, but this is pulling it out of the config file. Right? This is saying, yeah. It's not, at that point, it's not even looking at it. By the time the actual request has come in, this has been changed to look at this element, this literal string here. Oh, here? Yeah, all right. Well, we can change that. I guess I could URI encode it. We could modify and put a URI encoded. What would you normally do? You just don't have them there all? All right, well, whatever. We can just... I just see how simple it is to fix. You just change, you just pop that out there, and it's done. So that's the kind of redirection list. Yeah, I want to be careful. I mean, all is almost certainly an exaggeration, but I do think that most of the ones that are currently used, I think all the ones used in use at Yahoo, I plan to subsume and just have this one plug-in to rule them all.
Everybody would just rewrite.
Yeah, but that should level off, right? There's only so many things you want to extract. Once you have, and the beauty is once you write an extractor, you can use it everywhere, right? Once you have something that extracts the outbound SSL cert, well, everybody gets to use it. It's done, right? You just put it anywhere you want. You put it in a header. So yeah, SSL headers is another one I want to get rid of. So yeah, it's quite ambitious. It actually it seems to be coming together quite nicely though. So this is one of the things that is driving the development of HTTP replay. This is what I am right now using. Why I've been working on HTTP replay is to test this because it makes testing this much easier, right? Because I can say here's all the headers on a thing, and here's the replies I think, here's the manipulations I expect to do. So no, those are being driven in parallel because I need HP replay to test this thoroughly.
Right way to say it or not? This is not Turing complete, right?
No, I was very, very careful about that because that way lies madness. So it's just YAML. Again, because of the way the selection works, it's a forest, right? So when you have a configuration, it's a forest, and you just descend through one of the trees to get to the end, and then you're done.
Yeah.
There's absolutely no looping.
Yeah.
So yes, I stole a lot of ideas from Ed's, T Manager, is that what it was?
EMGR.
TMGR, yes.
Yeah.
For many of the same reasons, right? It's driven the same way. So this is absolutely not Turing complete. It does not allow any looping.
Yeah. So like I was having some debate with some folks, I forgot, a couple of years back about like header rewrite versus like Lua. Then, easily to test whether it is Turing complete is, can you find out if the incoming number of headers is odd number of headers or even number of headers? And so that's one of the way to
Well, actually, you
figure
can do
out.
that with this.
Yeah, so you cannot do that with this, yes. Yeah.
Because you can put a modifier that does a divide and look at whether it's 0 or 1. Right, I do, I hate to be mean to Kit too, but I do expect this to replace a lot of the current uses of the Lua plugin, right? For a lot of places, we read very simple replacement of headers with a little bit of logic. This suits that use case very admirably, right? Especially the default stuff. You know, you don't even do a condition. You just say default this field to this value, and well, there you are.
Finding this to support transform use cases, or
No, not currently. I'm not really sure how that would work.
because that would be the other class of plugins that's
Yeah, those
everything
I'm not
left.
going to be able to replace.
Yeah, it'd be great to have one single plugin. I love eliminating the order problem. Although it seems like the config file could become giant with this.
Well,
so we'll have to deal with that.
Have you seen our remap config files? I mean, that ship has sailed. Right. Yes, he said that configs can get very large. Yes, they are. But I've discussed that with some of the ops guys, and this came up at the ATC track at ApacheCon. And the general consensus was that people who have files that large are not writing them by hand. They are generating them, right? In which case it doesn't really matter, right? And one of the things I try to do with here is try to be as YAML as possible to make that generation as easy as possible. Not a lot of special rules here about the syntax. It's all YAMLized, and so you can just spit this YAML out and do the YAML processing on it. That was a big deal here.
And this is all reloadable, so you could update it through a control plane or something, right?
Yeah, so it's bulk reloadable. That is one of the problems that I need to look at in that there's no good, this is why I asked you that question earlier, there's no good way to reach in and say, I want to update this rule, right? So, you want to update this match here. Well, how do you even tell the plugin that you want to update that? There's no good handle. There's you could do some syntax with, well, I want to go to transaction box and the first when, like XPath kind of stuff. But guys, have you ever used XPath? People who have say, no, don't do that, right? So that's hard, but this is going to be a general problem, which you all should think about, not just for transaction box. If we actually do the full transition to YAML, then a lot of these traffic control things become very problematic in terms of what exactly is it that I'm updating, right? How do I even describe or label the thing I want to change? Yeah, but then how do you get to the point where you say I want the ID of this thing? And I'm not saying it's not solvable, but it is not a thing that's going to run trippingly off somebody's fingers. Deep thought is going to have to be applied to this to get something that's actually workable in practice. So yeah, I mean that would certainly be useful, but that's for humans. When you want to talk to the RPC and say, yo, RPC, change this, you numbered all of yours and used hash values to find them, but this is not going to work here, and I don't know what to do. But it's not, again, it's not a problem just for all the YAML configs are going to have this problem. Now, of course, what I did was I made bulk, so you can just say, well, here's a brand new config, load it up. Possibly if the config loading is fast enough, it's not that big a deal. We'll have to see.
So what's preventing you from testing this at scale?
Personal confidence. I mean, I've tested it at scale. When we did the prod testing, we put it on a prod box, and it ran at scale. It was doing beaconing, so it was getting hundreds, if not thousands, of requests per second.
Well, I mean, like replacing your replay file.
Placing my...
Sorry, not replay, your remap file.
Oh, that, yes.
Your remap file.
Well, coding work. I need to do the little string optimization logic. I know how to do that. It's fairly straightforward. It's, again, just work. I think at this point, I've pretty much broken through all the technological hurdles that I thought I'd face. The stuff I have left to do is simply work. The IP space is really tricky, but it already had that code. I just have to port it to C++ 17 in this environment. The code already exists. It already works. It was in a commercial product, actually. Fortunately, I know the CEO of that company, and he said I could use the code. So, all right. Well, thank you all for your time.